Okay, so welcome back to the next lesson, everybody. In this lesson, before we jump into the drawing, I'm first going to teach you how to stretch watercolor paper. We need to stretch the paper before we can work on it, because if we simply start applying water during the drawing phase, then the paper will just warp and you'll have lots of lumps and bumps, which are going to be very annoying to work with. So I'm using Fabriano watercolor paper, and it is 300 grams per square meter, as you can tell the number there in the corner. And the surface I'm working on is a hot pressed surface, which basically just means it's a very smooth surface to work on. Although you can work on cold pressed if you prefer a rougher surface to work with. That's entirely fine as well. Now you're going to need your water activated tape, and you're also going to need a sponge and a container filled with water to do this. You can just see I've just spilt some water on that. So I'm actually fast forwarding this video. I'm just doing a voiceover, and I've decided to speed this video up because it's very boring watching paper dry. This is a very time-consuming process, so you have to have a lot of patience with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wet my sponge, get it nice and wet, and I'm going to push it against the paper along the vertical axis, do the same on the horizontal axis, and then use the corner of the sponge to go along the page from corner to corner. So you can see I'm kind of creating a Union Jack with the water here. And I read this in a book about architectural rendering, which was written sometime in the early 20th century. And basically the theory was the paper would stretch better if you went along the axes, because they would be more saturated than the rest of the page. So here you can see I'm going along now, and I am just wetting the rest of the page. But you want to keep going along the vertical and horizontal axis as well as the diagonals several times over, and then wet the page, because you really want the centers of the page to be wet. And now I'm just squeezing water all over the page, and I'm pushing it into the page, picking the water up, squeezing it again. It's a very repetitive process, and you can see that the paper is starting to buckle. There are bumps and hills in the page, and I'm just squeezing water and pushing the sponge against it to flatten that paper out. So the page will buckle, and our objective is to flatten it completely. And you do that by moving the water around the page and pressing against it firmly with the sponge. And you do this several times over, going along the edges, making sure you're getting those air bubbles out. And 300 GSM, that is very thick paper, so it is going to take you some time to get it fully flat. It's quite a stubborn paper on account of how thick it is, so you have to do this several times over. So I'm wetting my sponge yet again, squeezing spongefuls of water all over the page. I'm kind of forming a shallow puddle on the paper there. So you want to make sure your drawing board, when you're doing this, is completely level, because you don't want water running off the board onto the floor. Make sure you're working on a completely flat surface. You can see I'm going along the axes again, coming back to the center of the page. Got some bumps down there with the T-square. And that's another thing. Make sure your paper is aligned with the T-square, and that it's completely level, because once you tape this paper onto the drawing board, that's it. You don't take it off the board until the drawing is done. So you've got to make sure you're using your T-square, make sure that the paper is aligned with it. Just moving the water around, moving the sponge around, trying to get those bumps out, squeezing the page yet again. And I do this. This is why I fast forwarded the video, because I do this a lot. And you want to get your piece of paper to the point where it's basically completely limp. So it should be like kind of like wet spaghetti. Just moving the water around. Now, you might notice some dust starts to settle on the page. That's okay, don't worry about that. You can get that off when the paper is dry. So try to ignore anything like that. You might also notice that there's some dark spots on my bit of paper. And that could be for a number of reasons. It could be the natural oils from my hands. Hopefully it's not. Here you can see I'm just demonstrating how limp the paper is now. So it's getting a lot softer. But those dark spots that are appearing, it could be one of two things. It could it could be the natural oils from my hands, which I'm hoping is not the case because I did wash my hands. But it might also just be where the water has kind of saturated into the paper a little bit more, and I think typically that is the case because when the paper dries, it's completely clear, and those darker spots, they're no longer visible when it dries. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, and don't worry about the dust settling on the page. That's normal too. You can wipe the page clean when it's completely dry. So I'm going along the diagonals again, using that Union Jack method. And I'm just kind of getting my head against the drawing board there. Because sometimes you'll notice bumps and lumps if you're looking at the page from a level perspective. So the reflections might give you some clues as to what's happening on the paper. So when you're looking at your paper, really get down low and have a look at it from a almost flat perspective, just to see exactly what's going on with those bumps. And if you do notice any bumps, just get the sponge on them, wet them down, push them out gently. Well, firmly, but, you know, not too firm that you tear the paper, obviously. I want to quickly apologize for the tripod legs that are in the way. Unfortunately, this was the only way I could set up the camera, so thankfully they're not in the way of the paper, but you know, it's not ideal. So I'm kind of just damping the page down again, and I'm just picking up some of the excess water, wiping it down, kind of drying it off a little bit. So if the paper is saturated, you'll want to just kind of use your sponge to pick up those puddles of water and put it back into the container. So the page is wet now, but it's not completely saturated. And you just need to let this dry for a little bit. And come back to it maybe 10 minutes later or 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later. Just kind of watch to see how it's drying. And if you notice there's any lumps or bumps, then again, use the sponge to iron them out. So I'm getting my water activated tape on there now. So I've activated it with a sponge. The sponge is wet, by the way. You have to activate it with water. And I'm pressing that tape along the surface of the paper first, and then I push it along the drawing board. I want to make sure it's attaching to the paper, and then I seal it onto the drawing board. About, you can just, I've just spilled a whole heap of water there on the page, so that's great. It's okay. put about half the tape's thickness onto the page and the other half on the drawing board. So you can see, well, my big fat head is getting in the way again. There we go. So I'm lifting up the tape and I'm just making sure that it's on the paper first. I'm sorry the view is terrible right now. There you go. So I'm just lifting the page up slightly, and now I'm pulling those corners apart. So I'm pulling it tightly so that they are nice and tight, pulling the corners further away. And then once I'm happy, I'm sticking that bit of tape onto the board like so. And you can see I get my nails into the edge of the paper to seal the tape there as well. So you want that tape to be nice and flat. You don't want any bumps or lumps. This is a very tricky process, admittedly. Can be tricky. You also want to start by taping the short side of the page first, then you do the long sides, then you do the short side for the last edge. So short side, long side, long side, short side. You can see I'm stretching that corner, pinning the other corner down with my other hand, and I'm stretching it, I'm pulling them apart because I want them to be properly stretched. You want that paper to be tight, because what happens during the drying process is the paper shrinks slightly, and that's how you get it flat. And if you've done it correctly, it should dry completely flat. The drying time is going to take a long time, admittedly. It's going to stay damp for an hour or two, maybe longer, depending on your climate. And you don't want to walk away from it while it's drying. I think it's really important that you stick around, make yourself some tea, or jump on your laptop, play a video game, or watch a movie, or even just work on another drawing. But make sure you're in the room with your drawing and you're watching it dry, making sure that it stays flat throughout the drying process. And if it's kind of getting a bit bumpy while it dries, you might have to just carefully peel that tape off, wet that page down again, stretch it out again, and then with fresh tape, try and stick it down again. It's going to be a very tedious process. But water-activated tape makes this process a lot easier. So that's why I told you to get this tape. So that paper is nice and tight on the board. I'm quite happy with it. And if everything's done correctly, it should dry completely flat. Okay, so I've come back the next day, and it's morning where I am right now, and this paper is completely bone dry. It did dry quite a lot last night, but it wasn't completely dry. But I left it on the table because it didn't seem like the tape was lifting up or anything, so I thought it's going to be safe to leave it overnight. And as you can see, that tape is firmly secured. Sometimes when you're stretching watercolor paper, thick paper like this will tend to buckle and the edges of the paper kind of lift the tape up. But with this tape, the water activated tape, or gum tape as some people call it, it really has secured that bit of paper, and it's just lying completely flat. You can see if I get down really low, there's no bumps, there's no lumps, it's just completely flat. So if you follow my instruction and use the right materials, you should get a very, very good result.